Welcome to Global Politics Today. We're the show that takes a whole stack of sources, dives deep into them, and really pulls out the key insights so you can get up to speed fast. Today, we are plunging pretty much headfirst into a really critical intersection. It's where geopolitics and economics meet, and it's been all over the headlines, sparking some pretty intense debate lately. We're talking, of course, about the relationship between the United States and India, specifically their trade relationship, which is, well, intricate, often volatile, and it's playing out under the, let's say, ever-lengthening shadow of potential future policies if we see a returning Trump administration. The immediate spark for this deep dive, it's former President Donald Trump's recent, very public focus on India, and maybe less surprisingly, his renewed threats of tariffs. Now, this isn't just some isolated comment. It feels like a significant development, especially when you consider India's increasingly pivotal role. It's become such a crucial strategic partner for the U.S., especially in this rapidly shifting global landscape we find ourselves in. So our mission today is really to unpack the layers of this incredibly complex relationship. We want to look at the historical tensions that have shaped it, analyze the very real current threats posed by these renewed tariff discussions, and explore the crucial geopolitical implications. Because, this goes far beyond just trade figures. We'll be drawing from recent analyses, expert commentaries, trying to move past the headlines to really explore the why behind these dynamics, and maybe most importantly, the what now for both nations.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here, if you really dig into it, is that while these talks about tariffs in India might feel like brand new news, they are in many critical ways sort of a reemergence, a return to tactics and, frankly, a consistent philosophy we saw throughout Trump's first term. But revisiting this now, especially with that 2025 timeline kind of hanging there if you were to win the upcoming election, it's just incredibly important. It's not simply rehashing old arguments. It gives us a really vital window into what a potential second Trump presidency might prioritize. In terms of trade policy, particularly with key partners like India, it really underscores that these aren't just off-the-cuff remarks or, passing campaign sound bites. They seem to reflect a deeply ingrained, consistent protectionist philosophy, one that's already shown it can lead to tangible action.
Okay, right. So let's unpack this with that context firmly in mind. We've seen former President Trump in his recent speeches specifically targeting India with these threats of higher tariffs. It really begs the question, why India specifically? I mean, this isn't just any country. We've been increasingly aligning with them strategically, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. So what makes this relationship a target for such, well, aggressive trade rhetoric right now?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head there. That's the core paradox, isn't it? The thing that makes this situation so incredibly complex. On one hand, yeah, India is undeniably a crucial strategic partner for the US, a key player, a bulwark in the Indo-Pacific. But on the other hand, it has simultaneously been a very significant point of contention when it comes to trade, certainly under Trump's previous administration. And it seems it remains so. Trump's long-standing complaints primarily focus on what he consistently frames as a US trade deficit with India. And he doesn't really articulate this deficit as, say, a natural outcome of global supply chains or different economic stages. No, his narrative is that India is taking advantage of the United States. His central argument really is that India imposes disproportionately high tariffs on American products. That makes it incredibly difficult for US goods to compete fairly over there, while at the same time Indian goods often face comparatively lower barriers coming into the US market. To make that a bit more concrete, let's look at some specific Indian tariffs that have notoriously drawn Trump's ire over the years. Motorcycles.
That's the classic, almost legendary example. Harley-Davidson in particular was often cited by Trump. He talked about import duties as high as 100% in India.
100%, wow.
I mean, imagine trying to sell an iconic American product when its price effectively doubles the moment it crosses the border. That wasn't just a talking point. It was a real barrier to market access for them. Then you've got tech goods. Indian tariffs and local content requirements have made American electronics, digital products less competitive. That impacts everything from smartphone sales to cloud computing services. And it's not just manufactured goods either. Agricultural exports from the U.S. think almonds, apples. They've also faced significant tariff barriers. That hits American farmers, who might otherwise be looking to expand into India's huge consumer market.
Right. So these aren't just abstract numbers then.
Exactly. These are real products, real American companies, real farmers, who, from Trump's perspective, are being unfairly disadvantaged by India's trade policies. These examples really serve as tangible proof points for his whole America First trade agenda. He argues the playing field isn't level, and he demands what he considers a fairer, more balanced approach, reciprocity.
And importantly, it's not just rhetoric, is it? We actually have historical precedent for this. His first term wasn't just about threats. There was real, tangible action. What steps did he take previously that really tell us these aren't just empty warnings this time around? And maybe, how effective were those actions? Did they achieve what he wanted, or were there unintended consequences that might give us clues about what happens next?
Absolutely, that's crucial. His past actions definitely give significant weight to his current threats. To really grasp the potential gravity of what could unfold, we absolutely have to look back at that first term. The most significant action, the one that really sent a clear signal, was when India lost its preferential trade status under the Generalized System of Preferences, the GSP.
DSP, right?
This wasn't some minor tweak. It was a major policy decision. It had direct, substantial financial impact on Indian exporters because it effectively revoked duty-free access for a whole range of their products into the, very lucrative U.S. market.
Okay, can you elaborate a bit more on what that GSP status actually meant for India? Why was losing it such a big deal?
Sure. So GSP status basically provided access to duty-free entry for literally billions of dollars worth of goods into the U.S. For Indian businesses, you can imagine, this was an enormous competitive advantage. It meant a vast array of their products, things like textiles, certain agricultural goods, grapes, mangoes, even some manufactured items like engineering goods, auto components. All of these could enter the huge American market without facing the import duties that other non-GSP countries would have to pay.
So it lowered the price for American buyers?
Effectively, yes. It lowered the cost for American importers and ultimately consumers, making those Indian goods highly attractive, very competitive. So when India lost this status back in June 2019, those duties were immediately slapped back on. The direct financial cost of this GSP loss for Indian exporters, well, estimates put it in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually. It affected something like $5.6 billion worth of goods.
Wow, that's significant.
It really is. And that increased cost had to go somewhere. Either the Indian exporter absorbed it, cutting deep into their profit margins, or, more commonly, it got passed on to the American importer and eventually to the American consumer. That made Indian goods less competitive compared to goods from other nations, or even domestically produced alternatives. It was a clear, unambiguous signal of Trump's willingness to use pretty significant trade leverage to get what he wanted. It demonstrated his complaints about unfair trade weren't just talk. They had real-world consequences, and it showed a readiness to disrupt established trade norms.
And it was around that time, specifically in 2019, that we heard that very direct, often quoted line from Donald Trump. India has been taking advantage of the United States for many years. That's not going to happen anymore. Beyond just being a memorable soundbite, what does that statement really tell us about his core philosophy, how he fundamentally views global trade?
Yeah, that quote, in just a few words, it perfectly encapsulates his core protectionist philosophy and his deeply ingrained perception of global trade imbalances. When he says India has been taking advantage of the United States, he's articulating a very distinctly zero-sum view of trade. It's this belief that in international commerce, one country's gain must necessarily be another country's loss.
Right, not a win-win situation in his eyes.
Exactly. He seems to see trade deficits not as these complex economic phenomena reflecting investment rates or consumer demand for imports or global supply chain efficiencies. No. He sees them as direct evidence of exploitation, unfair practices by other nations. And that really contrasts sharply with mainstream economic thinking, which often views deficits as, well, a natural consequence of capital flows and overall economic activity. And the second part, that's not going to happen anymore. That's a powerful declaration of intent, isn't it?
Excellent.
It signifies a decisive shift, a move away from what he saw as passive acceptance of these supposedly unfair practices towards an active, aggressive stance, one designed to unilaterally correct what he perceived as imbalances. This quote is really a cornerstone of his broader America First agenda. National economic interests, as he defines them, take absolute precedence over multilateral trade agreements, established norms, maybe even diplomatic considerations sometimes. It was basically a promise to fundamentally rebalance trade relationships by any means necessary, including punitive tariffs, revoking trade benefits, all aimed at protecting American industries and jobs, kind of regardless of the potential impact on long-standing diplomatic or strategic relationships. It essentially communicates a willingness to dismantle existing trade frameworks if that's what it takes to achieve what he believes is a fair deal for the U.S.
Which brings us back to today, because here's where it gets really interesting. That philosophy is clearly back front and center. Fast forward to the 2024 campaign trail, and we're hearing a strikingly similar tune, maybe even louder this time. He's once again floating this idea of reciprocal tariffs. This doesn't feel like just a casual remark, does it? It seems like a very deliberate, maybe even more aggressive stance. The language he's using seems to suggest an escalation.
Oh, it's absolutely deliberate. And you're right, in some key ways, it does feel like an escalation of his previous rhetoric, certainly in its bluntness. He's been quite explicit about the aggressive nature of his recent threats. He said, and this is a direct quote, "If India slaps us with 100% tariffs, we'll hit them right back, maybe double that. Fair trade is not a one-way street."
Maybe double that. That's punchy.
It is. And it's not just about balancing tariffs, right? It's about a punitive, escalating approach designed either to force immediate compliance or, well, inflict significant economic pain. Now, the meaning of reciprocal tariffs in this context is really crucial to unpack because it seems to go beyond simple mirroring.
How so?
Well, it's not necessarily about imposing the exact same tariff rate a country imposes on a specific U.S. good. As Trump suggests with the maybe double that line, it's more of a tit-for-tat approach that can rapidly escalate duties. Often it seems aimed at perceived unfairness overall, rather than just achieving numerical parity on one product line. So, for instance, if India's high tariffs on, say, American almonds make it tough for U.S. farmers to compete, Trump's response might not just be a tariff on Indian almonds. Instead, his policy might involve broader demands for market access across the board. Or maybe even punitive tariffs on completely different Indian sectors or products, things that would really hurt, designed to force a systemic change in their trade policy, not just level one specific playing field.
So it's a leverage play.
Exactly. It's a strategy rooted in maximum leverage, a willingness to initiate what could quickly spiral into a tariff war, where each side just keeps raising duties in response to the other. It creates this cycle of economic friction. The approach is intended either as a strong deterrent or as a very blunt instrument to force concessions.
So the million-dollar question then. Is this just campaign rhetoric, designed to fire up his base, grab headlines? Or is this a real harbinger of future policy? How much weight should we actually put on these remarks in terms of what a potential second Trump administration might actually do, especially given all the complexities of global trade we've been talking about?
Well, look, it's certainly true that some of these remarks might be amplified for the campaign trail, right? They're designed to resonate with voters who feel that American jobs have been lost due to unfair trade practices. That's a powerful message. But to dismiss them entirely as just rhetoric, I think that would be a serious mistake. They undeniably reflect a continued, deeply ingrained push for protectionist policies.
Yeah.
This has been a hallmark of his political identity for decades, long before he even got to the White House.
Right, this isn't a new idea for him.
Not at all. It's a consistent worldview that trade imbalances are inherently unfair and need to be corrected through aggressive negotiation and, if necessary, punitive tariffs. So even if the exact double that figure might be, a rhetorical flourish, the underlying intent is clear. He intends to use tariffs as a primary tool of trade policy to demand greater market access and to unilaterally impose costs on countries he deems unfair. That seems very real, and as we've discussed, it has a proven track record from his first term.
And if he does return to office, what could the broader impact be? You mentioned these policies could reshape global trade dynamics. What does that actually mean in practice? What might that look like?
That's a significant and, frankly, rather unsettling question for a lot of international economists and businesses right now. Reshaping global trade dynamics. Well, it could mean several things. We could see increased fragmentation of global supply chains. They're already stressed, already undergoing reevaluation after the pandemic, and other shocks.
Friendshoring and nearshoring.
Exactly. Countries might accelerate those initiatives,
Yeah.
trying to reduce their reliance on imports from nations that could suddenly face new tariffs, nations deemed problematic. This could lead to the faster formation of new, often smaller, regional trade blocs. Countries might seek preferential deals with like-minded nations to kind of bypass these new barriers, potentially sidelining bigger multilateral agreements like the WTO.
So a shift away from global institutions.
Potentially, yes. A significant shift away from bodies like the World Trade Organization towards more bilateral, quite aggressive deal-making where economic power dictates the terms. This kind of protectionism could potentially stifle global economic growth by reducing overall trade volumes. It could raise costs for consumers worldwide because imports get more expensive. And it could spark widespread retaliatory measures from other major trading partners.
Leading to broader trade wars.
Exactly. Leading to broader economic instability and trade wars that arguably benefit no one in the long run. The ripple effects would be felt across industries, across national economies globally. It could potentially reverse decades of economic integration.
Okay, so let's pull back for the bigger picture here. We've been talking a lot about the economic pressures, the tariffs, the GSP loss. But here's the critical catch, isn't it? India is not just another trade partner. We really need to shift our focus now from the purely economic to the deeply interwoven geopolitical dimension of this whole US-India relationship. What's truly at stake here, beyond just the trade figures, it feels like a classic dilemma. You've got economic leverage on one side and strategic imperative on the other.
Precisely. This is the crucial nuance that really complicates any straightforward economic approach. It makes this a strategic balancing act of immense proportions. India is unequivocally not just another trade partner. It holds immense strategic significance for the United States, especially in the context of these rapidly evolving global power dynamics, particularly, vis-a-vis China.
Can you elaborate on that strategic role? Why is India so important from that perspective?
Sure. So first, it's a major player, arguably the major player in the Indo-Pacific region. This vast area stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, it's increasingly the geopolitical and geoeconomic center of gravity. It's home to the world's most dynamic economies, but also major security challenges, including obviously China's growing assertiveness. India's sheer geographic position, this massive population, its growing economic and military might, it makes it indispensable to any effective U.S. strategy in that vital region. Second, India is a crucial member of the QAD alliance.
The Quad, right? US, Japan, Australia, India.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. Now, it's deliberately not a formal military alliance, but its purpose is pretty clearly understood. It's about promoting a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, and implicitly, often explicitly, that involves coordinating efforts to counter the rising influence and assertive actions of China in the region. Think of it not just as a diplomatic forum, but as a strategic alignment. It fosters interoperability, shared norms across critical maritime corridors.
Things like the Malabar naval exercises.
Precisely. Joint exercises like Malabar, involving all four QAD nations, they signal a collective commitment to security in a region that's increasingly vital for global trade and stability. And perhaps most critically, India is a rising democratic power. It's actively counterbalancing China's influence across Asia. The U.S. views India as a natural democratic partner, one that can help check Beijing's ambitions, whether that's in maritime security disputes in the South China Sea, or regional diplomacy in Southeast Asia, or economic influence across the developing world. This strategic alignment is really a core pillar of U.S. foreign policy in Asia. It makes India's stability and partnership absolutely paramount.
Okay, so given that deep strategic importance, that critical role India plays, what are the potential strategic consequences if this economic friction, driven by these renewed tariff threats, becomes too intense? If the U.S. does, as you quoted that analyst, push India away economically, what's the actual geopolitical fallout look like?
Well, that foreign policy analyst put it quite starkly, didn't they? Pushing India away economically could severely weaken the U.S. strategic position in the Indo-Pacific. And this is such a critical insight because it highlights how economic ties often fundamentally underpin strategic alliances. It's not just about dollars and cents or rupees. Robust economic cooperation builds trust, it creates shared interests, it fosters interdependence, it provides a durable foundation for broader political and security alignment.
So damaging one can damage the other.
Potentially, yes. If the U.S. were to impose significant economic pressure, or if these trade disputes are seen as a form of economic coercion, it really risks alienating India, even if the strategic rationale for the partnership remains strong on paper. And this alienation could manifest in several practical ways. India might become less willing to cooperate on sensitive security or intelligence matters, maybe reduce its participation in crucial joint military exercises, or even scale back its diplomatic support for U.S. initiatives in international forums. Furthermore, by creating this economic friction, the U.S. could inadvertently incentivize India to, well, diversify its partnerships away from the West.
Meaning looking towards Russia or China.
It could mean deepening its economic and even strategic ties with countries like Russia, which has historically been a major arms supplier to India. Or, ironically, perhaps even with China, despite their own significant geopolitical tensions and border disputes. This would directly undermine the U.S. goal of building a stronger counterweight to Beijing's influence in Asia. Now, this isn't to say India would suddenly abandon the U.S. or pit it to an adversarial stance. That's probably unlikely. But continued economic disputes could create significant cracks in what is otherwise a burgeoning strategic partnership. It could weaken the collective front against shared challenges in the Indo-Pacific and potentially open doors for rival powers to gain influence.
Okay, now let's turn the lens back again, but this time focus specifically on the economic impacts on the U.S. itself. We've talked a lot about India as a target for tariffs, but how deep is the U.S. reliance on India? What are the tangible implications for American businesses, for American consumers, if a trade war escalates? It's easy to forget sometimes that trade really is a two-way street.
That's such a crucial point, and one that often gets overlooked when the focus is solely on trade deficits and what the U.S. imports versus exports. India is, in fact, a key supplier of essential goods and services to the U.S. Our economies are quite interdependent in ways that directly impact American lives and businesses every day. We're not just selling things to India, we're buying critical products and services that underpin various sectors of our own economy.
Like what specifically? What are the key
Well,
areas?
first and foremost, you have to talk about affordable pharmaceuticals. India is often called the pharmacy of the world. It supplies a staggering proportion. Some estimates put it over 40% of the generic drugs consumed right here in the U.S.
40%. Wow.
Yeah. And these aren't luxury items, right? These are crucial, often life-saving medications that American patients rely on daily for a huge range of conditions, common ailments, chronic diseases like diabetes, heart conditions. And the affordable aspect is absolutely paramount here. If significant tariffs were suddenly imposed on Indian pharmaceuticals, the cost of these essential medicines for American consumers and for the U.S. healthcare system as a whole would inevitably rise. That impacts household budgets and could potentially even impact public health by making vital drugs less accessible or simply more expensive.
Okay. Beyond pharmaceuticals.
Beyond pharma, India is a massive provider of software services and IT outsourcing. Many American tech companies, from nimble startups all the way up to global giants like Google and Microsoft, rely very heavily on Indian talent and IT services. For everything from software development, maintenance, customer support, data processing, back office operations, this reliance actually extends to nearly every industry. Indian IT services are kind of an invisible but critical backbone of the modern American economy.
So disruption there would be costly.
Hugely costly. A disruption in that sector due to trade friction could lead to significantly higher operational costs for American businesses.
Yeah.
That could impact their competitiveness, their innovation, maybe even the quality of customer service they can provide. And lastly, you've got textiles and apparel. Maybe not as headline-grabbing as tech or pharma, but India is a major supplier of textiles, ready-made garments. Tariffs here would directly translate to higher prices for clothing, home furnishings, other textile goods for American consumers, adding to inflationary pressures. So, in essence, a tariff war really isn't a one-sided affair at all. It could definitely boomerang back, raising costs and disrupting supply chains across multiple critical sectors for American businesses and, ultimately, for you, the consumer.
So if we pull all of that together, the GSP history, the specific products like pharma, the IT services, textiles, what would a full-blown tariff war between the U.S. and India actually mean for the average American, practically speaking, in their daily lives?
A full-blown tariff war. Well, without sugarcoating it, it could raise costs significantly. For American businesses, yes, but critically for consumers too. The mechanism is pretty straightforward. When you increase import duties on goods coming from India, those higher costs don't just vanish. They're either absorbed by the importing American business, which can severely cut their profit margins, hinder investment, maybe even force layoffs, or, much more commonly, those increased costs get passed on either fully or partially to the consumer in the form of higher prices on store shelves.
So everyday items get more expensive.
Potentially, yes. A wide array of goods you rely on could become more expensive. From your prescription meds, as we discussed, maybe the software your business uses, the clothes you buy for your family, perhaps even certain food items. The price tags could see a noticeable jump. For consumers, that translates directly into reduced purchasing power. Every dollar stretches less far. It contributes to a higher overall cost of living. And for businesses, especially those deeply plugged into global supply chain sourcing from India, higher import duties mean significantly higher operational costs. This can squeeze already thin margins, make American products less competitive globally, and potentially contribute to broader inflationary pressures across the economy. Companies either raise prices or have to find more expensive domestic alternatives. Plus, it just injects significant uncertainty and instability into supply chains. Businesses might have to scramble for alternative suppliers, absorb new costs. It disrupts production and planning for months, maybe years. It's really a scenario where both sides tend to feel substantial economic pain, and the consumer often ends up bearing the brunt.
Okay, looking ahead then. If we do see a Trump administration in 2025, What might the next phase of negotiations actually look like? You mentioned India has shown some willingness to engage and resolve disputes in the past, but how might Trump's more aggressive America First style play into that dynamic? Could it actually make reaching agreements harder this time?
Well, if Trump does win in 2025, I think it's highly probable his administration would indeed revive those hardline trade negotiations with India, echoing the tactics, the demands of his first term. His focus would likely remain squarely on reducing that bilateral trade deficit and aggressively tackling specific tariffs he considers unfair or too high. We expect strong demands for greater market access for American goods and services. Now, as you said, it's absolutely important to remember that India has shown in the past a pragmatic willingness to resolve some disputes. They've demonstrated a somewhat flexible, adaptive approach to maintaining a functional economic relationship with the U.S.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. During his first term, even after the GSP was revoked, India kept talking. They made some concessions on issues like digital taxes, which impact American tech giants, or on market access for certain U.S. agricultural products like chickpeas, lentils, even some medical devices. So this suggests India isn't entirely inflexible. They understand the critical importance of the U.S. market, U.S. investment, and the broader strategic relationship. They are capable of negotiating. But the critical caveat, and this is where the dynamic gets really funny, is that Trump's aggressive, very transactional style could easily lead to new friction. Even if India comes to the table genuinely willing to negotiate, his approach isn't always about traditional give and take based on established trade rules. It often involves public naming and shaming, unilateral demands, the direct threat of severe penalties, all to force a quick resolution that he can frame as a win.
Right, the deal-making aspect.
Exactly. So even if India comes forward with what seem like reasonable concessions, Trump's America First posture, his zero-sum view of trade, it could mean that any proposed concessions from India might just be seen as insufficient. That could lead to prolonged disputes, more heated rhetoric, maybe even new rounds of tariffs. It's a dynamic that really risks turning what could be cooperative problem-solving into prolonged confrontations. And that could potentially undermine the very strategic alliance that both nations actually value quite highly.
So, given all of this complexity, what does this all mean for the long-term relationship between these two nations? Nations that are, strategically speaking, becoming increasingly vital to one another. The real question, as some of our sources framed it, seems to be this. Will this kind of pressure ultimately lead to better deals for the U.S.? Or does it risk pushing India closer to other powers, like Russia or China? Could it inadvertently undermine the very strategic goals the U.S. is trying to achieve in the Indo-Pacific?
That is truly the central dilemma, isn't it? It's the core challenge for U.S. policymakers as they try to navigate the future of this incredibly complex relationship. On one hand, yes, a hardline approach might, from Trump's perspective, secure better deals, lower tariffs for U.S. goods, reduce trade deficits, greater market access for American companies. The argument there would be that these strong-arm tactics are simply necessary. You have to use them to force concessions that India wouldn't otherwise offer, ultimately benefiting American businesses, American workers, and correcting these perceived long-standing imbalances.
But the risk...
But the significant risk, and this is one that foreign policy analysts, strategists are deeply concerned about, is that this economic pressure could ultimately backfire. It could push India closer to other powers, like Russia or China. You have to remember, India is a proudly sovereign nation. It has its own complex geopolitical interests, deep historical ties, and a very deeply ingrained policy of strategic autonomy. They don't like being pushed around. Now, while the U.S. and India are often described as natural allies, shared democratic values, common interest in balancing China trade remains this fundamental, often very sticky point of contention.
A persistent irritant.
Exactly. A persistent irritant that really has the potential to overshadow those deeper strategic convergences. So if economic pressure from the U.S. becomes too severe, or if it's perceived as undermining India's national sovereignty or its economic growth, India might strategically pivot, or at least deepen its relationships with other nations who offer maybe more favorable terms, or are willing to overlook trade imbalances for geopolitical gains. This could include increased military cooperation, energy ties with Russia, historically a major arms supplier and partner in certain forms, or it could perhaps ironically lead to expanded economic ties with China, despite their own very volatile border disputes, if Beijing offers attractive infrastructure investment or maybe more favorable trade terms.
Which would undermine U.S. strategy.
Directly. Such a shift would directly undermine the U.S.'s long-term strategy in the Indo-Pacific. The underlying truth, I think, is that India and the U.S. are natural allies in a broader strategic sense, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, and as the world's largest democracies. They share concerns about regional stability, maritime security, China's rise. But despite this overarching alignment, trade remains that sticking point. And with Trump threatening higher tariffs once again, and with India guarding its economic interests very closely, the next phase of U.S.-India relations might indeed get a lot bumpier. It's going to force both nations to really carefully weigh those immediate economic gains against crucial long-term strategic imperatives.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the really complex world of US India trade relations, especially under this looming shadow of a potential Trump return, let's just recap that core tension. We've explored how former President Trump's renewed tariff threats against India aren't just, fleeting rhetoric. They seem to represent a consistent, deeply ingrained push for protectionist policies. We looked back at the historical context, specifically that significant GSP revocation, which clearly showed the tangible impact his previous actions had. And we've really highlighted India's absolutely critical strategic role, not just as a trade partner, but as a vital counterweight to China, a key member of the QAD alliance. This isn't just a simple trade dispute, it's a high-stakes balancing act. It involves strategic alignment, economic leverage, and that delicate dance of geopolitical partnership. So for you, our listener, here's maybe a provocative thought to consider as you go about your day, drawing right from the core of what we've been discussing. Should the U.S. consistently play hardball on trade? Even with strategically vital allies like India, potentially pushing them, maybe unintentionally, towards rivals, or is a more nuanced, perhaps more diplomatic approach one that maybe prioritizes long-term strategic alliance building over settling every immediate economic grievance actually the smarter move in today's incredibly interconnected and complex world? It's a question that really forces us to ponder that fundamental balance between short-term economic leverage and long-term geopolitical stability. We definitely encourage you to keep exploring these complex global affairs, keep digging into the why behind the headlines, and always try to seek out multiple perspectives. Thanks for joining us on Global Politics today. Stay informed, stay curious.